Welcome and thanks for joining us for Two Steps Forward, our daily Bible study. I'm James. This is Aid. We are up to 286, episode 286 in our studies. Today we're going to do something that we haven't actually, I don't think we've done in the entirety of this series. We're doing 3 chapters together. Leviticus 23, 24, 25. A couple different reasons. Leviticus chapters are trying to grab multiple devotional thoughts from each chapter in some chapters is maybe a little bit of a stretch. So we're going to maybe grab one from each chapter. But I think your experience of Leviticus has been the general experience that people get when studying Leviticus, where it's a little confusing to modern people, a little bit offensive at times, and another a little curious as far as how do we apply this to the modern context. Remember, Leviticus talks about the holiness of God. It talks about how we're worshiping creatures created by God for God to worship God. That when we do so in terms of sacrifices in our lives, our time, our energy, our money, our relationships, our lives. But we do this to reciprocate that God has reconciled us through the ultimate sacrifice, the blood sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. All right. So make sure we're not going to waste any time here and try to be as efficient as possible. If you need to pause right now and read Leviticus 23, please do so. Here's my personal summary for it. This whole chapter is about the appointed festivals. It says in this chapter, God gave Moses a summary of instructions for the Israelites regarding the festivals they were to celebrate every year. First of all, the Sabbath, which is not a yearly festival, is a weekly thing. Every week there's a Sabbath day of rest or worship to the Lord. The Passover festival begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. For 7 days, the Israelites should eat bread without yeast, and on the 7th day, they hold a sacred assembly. The Israelites were to give a first fruit offering in which they presented grain, oil, and wine. 7 weeks after the Passover festival, 50 days, in other words, which actually we're just celebrating right now in our calendar, the Israelites are to gather with bread offerings, 7 male lambs, a young bull, and 2 rams. This is called the Festival of Weeks, also known as Pentecost. It's a harvest festival. The edges of the field were not to be reaped at the harvest. This was to go to the poor and the foreigners. Then you get something called the Festival of Trumpets. That's on the first day of the 7th month. There is to be a Sabbath rest, referred to as the Festival of Trumpets. The most important day in the Israelite calendar was on the 10th day of the 7th month, which is called Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The Israelites were to fast, and they were to give a food offering to the Lord. There was no work done on that day. We've talked about the Day of Atonement in a prior chapter. And lastly, on the 15th day of that same month, so this is after the Day of Atonement, the 15th day of the 7th month, there was a festival called the Festival of Tabernacles. No work is to be done. They were to present food offerings for 7 days, and then they have a sacred assembly at the end of the week. These festivals were all in addition to the regular offerings and Sabbath days. During this celebration, the Israelites were to live in tents, acknowledging that this planet was merely a temporary dwelling for them. So they wandered through the wilderness, obviously in tents, but even after they settled in the land, they had to regularly go out. They have houses, but they have to go in tent out in their yards, for a week, as a reminder that we're strangers in this world. We're visitors here. This whole thing is to remind them we're strangers in this world, and God actually brought us out through Moses, brought us out through the wilderness from Egypt, from slavery. Mm. All right, Leviticus 23. Mm-hmm. Devotional thought. First one for the day, the calendar of Israel. So Israel's calendar by design it's based on, it's both a solar and lunar calendar. So which means it's based on both the positions of the sun and the moon in the sky, which is why we get weird and quirky things like Easter, which changes throughout the year, from year to year, as far as what time it happens. But it's the rhythm of the seasons that's supposed to tell about the history of the ancient people, but also foreshadow and anticipate what God is going to do for them in the future. So, for instance, a couple of really interesting things, like Christ is the Passover lamb, and guess when he dies? He dies right at Passover. The special first fruit offering that's made by the priest the day after the Sabbath that follows Passover. Guess when that is? The first fruit offering is collected on Easter Sunday. That's the day on which Jesus rose. He's the first fruit of God's people. The church starts on what we call Pentecost, but they called it Pentecost too, as a harvest festival and a first fruit festival. So the salvation of Jesus Christ, the founding of the church, the future of God's people, they're all illustrated in these kind of 7 feasts, which even that is probably worth mentioning. The word feast doesn't mean, we think of it as meaning like a big food festival. It doesn't actually mean that. It means specifically an appointed time for proclamation. And in fact, even certain of days like the Day of Atonement was actually marked by fasting, not eating. So the festival is the appointed time for proclamation of God's truth. They were conscious to look back at moments that were important in their history, and they were also to look ahead toward and anticipate what God had already promised to them. My question, I think, and comment for you is the New Testament church doesn't really have any mandatory festivals. So the early Christians decided they were going to move from Sabbath day to Sunday because Jesus rose from the grave and the church started Pentecost on a Sunday. So that's become kind of a big day for Christians historically, but even then, that's like nothing's mandated about that. That's just a man-made custom. Nonetheless, the Old Testament believers had a ton of specific festivals and days. New Testament believers don't.
It seems like a lot. First of all, when I was reading it, I was thinking, like, how do they remember all this? But I guess that's why God had to give them this book to write down so the priest could tell them.
And the priests, yep.
Like, that's why it has to be so specific. I was also thinking when it says, like, you can't do any ordinary work, you can't do any ordinary work. I'm like, when are they working to pay for all their sacrifices?
Well, so...
Like, what if someone told you you have to live in your yard, in your front yard in a tent, and you can't do any work? You'd go crazy.
So, remember, what is the purpose of not working?
Resting.
Well, so it's physical rest for their bodies. To remember we're finite creatures, but more positively. So like there's a negative with us. We can't go constantly or we'll break down. God is telling us that because he's infinite. But it's also an opportunity then to express trust. Like, so this is one of those things where Christians, even when it comes to like our offerings or like when I don't know how something's going to work out, but I nonetheless submit to God's will and I don't circumvent his will. So like I don't steal to provide for my family. I trust that God is going to somehow provide for my family. That is an exercise in faith. And God always wants believers to exercise trust and faith in him. And so by not working, they're saying, okay, we don't exactly know. How is it that for instance, there's a Sabbath year every 7 years. How is it that on the 6th year, there's always going to be so much food that we just bring in enough? And guess what? God is going to get us through that 6th and 7th year through that amount of food. Same thing with the Year of Jubilee. They're going to wait 2 years. They don't work the land. They are allowed, interestingly, to take stuff that is naturally produced by the land. So fields will grow automatically. They just grow better if you tend to them, and produce more if you plant them and cultivate them. But stuff that naturally produces, they were allowed to take that. But the rest of the time, it's like you don't work specifically because you're going to trust God. And the rhythms of life, the rhythms of their calendar, the idea that like the sun comes up in a natural time, the next season, fall is going to come or spring is going to come. There's a level of like, we're trusting God to provide this. And they choose not to. I think I'm not the type of person that loves big celebrations, as you know about me. Like the idea of like getting up for a special celebration, birthday or anything like that. Like it's just not right. I'm more of like a rhythms of life. And actually I think even like maybe generationally, I think younger generations are maybe more into like lifestyle pattern things than like specific big events. But I'm still wondering about the importance of Christians and like looking back, looking forward, and specific occasions to do stuff like that.
Yeah. What would you say your favorite holiday is?
Well, so this is the question. Part of the question that I wanted to get to is like we wouldn't have to celebrate Christmas. We wouldn't have to celebrate Easter. We wouldn't have to worship on and a lot of time we worship primarily on Saturdays right now. So like we wouldn't have to do like so but what would happen if we didn't? Is I guess what I'm thinking, would the Christian church suffer? And I think it probably would. Like if we didn't have conscious moments celebrating the incarnation of Christ, God becoming human, and Christ dying and rising, the idea that it would just be sufficiently celebrated on a week-to-week basis, I think you need like those disruptions.
Yeah. I've always kind of said Easter is like one of my least favorite holidays. It's not that it's actually Easter, but there is so much build up to Easter. I think so. My sinful nature does not like being told what to do or being obligated to things. So when I feel Easter's coming, I feel like, oh, this is someone's obligating me on my Wednesdays, and
to worship midweek,
and then when Easter comes to Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, it just feels like a lot. But this feels like a lot to me too. All of these festivals, I'm like, it is a lot. And you're right. If we didn't have Easter, all the worship leading up, I don't know that I would ever take time annually to really think about what Jesus went through on Good Friday.
Which I would agree with. It's like when I was in school and people told me exactly what I had to read. I didn't always love reading those things, but when I get to freely choose what I want to read, I love doing it. I think when somebody makes it obligatory, it feels like it's taking some of the life out of it. That said, there are some obligations that are just clearly healthy for us. And so I think, like what the Christian church has come to do, which again, we don't know that, for instance, Christmas, the date of December 25th, there's nothing about that we think. In fact, we're almost certain it isn't the time of year when Jesus was born. So is it right to still celebrate it then? I don't know. Like the idea that there's something that you'd build, although I do think the longer you go with certain man-made traditions, the more culture piles on top of that. And so, for instance, historically, human beings didn't always do a massive gift-giving celebration on Christmas. Is it possible that we've arrived at a point in history where it is so corrupted by like materialism that we should be starting something different? I think there's like worthwhile considerations for things like that.
I think Christmas is almost completely like a secular holiday at this.
Right.
Even for the sheer fact that you get Christmas off at work, you don't get Easter.
Yeah.
Because Easter is considered a religious.
Which again, weirdly, because the name of Christ is actually in it. But that's my point is, as time goes on, anything that's man-made has a tendency to start falling apart. And I think the idea of the specific holiday of Christmas that's like a national or global holiday, I just like every once in a while I think it's worth Christians like reevaluating, okay, what are the ceremonies that we do to remember and honor who God is and what he did, and I think you can go overboard with it too. So Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy pretty much have saint days 365 days a year to honor so-and-so who did such and such. And it's like, all right, I'm not even, the idea of like veneration of certain humans that, that aren't Christ, I'm not crazy about. But additionally, I think it's just, how do you keep track of that?
Maybe Christmas should be a birthday party for Jesus, and then you only give presents to Jesus.
That would probably make some sense.
In the form of offerings or gifts to those less fortunate than you.
Didn't you say that your mom baked a birthday cake to Jesus?
I feel like I remember, yes, her baking a
birthday cake to Jesus.
Like, not every year, but
I'm always game for cake if there's ice cream. So
it's a pretty good idea, right?
Yeah, it's not a bad idea. But the idea of like it being a celebration, what do we overtly do to make this a celebration of Christ? Because you just think of what kids become conditioned by, and kids get a little bit like monsters around Christmas. And it's like, okay, clearly something's off here. How do we not see this as a like sort of toxic habit right now? But all right, the rhythms. So just thinking about the rhythms of your life and the intentional, willful times so generally speaking, the Bible wants us to live in the present. Jesus says in Matthew 6, don't worry about tomorrow. It'll take care of yourself. Focus on today. Like that's a good encouragement. But there are also rhythms and times where it's good to focus back on what Christ has done, God has done for us, and forward on what we know is going to come in the future. All right, moving on. Leviticus 24. If you need to pause and read here, go ahead and do so. Here's my summary. So this section is about the olive oil and bread that is set before the Lord by the priests. God instructs Moses to tell the Israelites that the lamps at the tent of meeting must burn continually and always be tended to. Also, the Israelites are to bake 12 loaves of bread to bring to the tent of meeting every Sabbath, and this is consumed ultimately by Aaron and his family and the priests. Then we get a very specific story in the second half of this chapter where the son of an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father gets into a fight with an Israelite boy. And during the fight, this young man blasphemes the name of the Lord. The young man is put in the custody of the priests until God makes it clear what Moses is supposed to do with him. The Israelites were instructed, again by God through Moses, to have those who heard the blasphemy place their hands on this boy's head, and the community was then to stone him to death. This is to happen to anyone who blasphemed the Lord's name, and the Israelites complied. Similarly, anyone who takes the life of another must be put to death. There was a law amongst the Israelites that whatever damage they do to another must be done to them, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and we get this reiterated by Jesus, but corrected in some respects in the Sermon on the Mount in the New Testament. But that's Leviticus 24. So what I want to get to for the devotional thought in this chapter is, I'm just going to call it consulting God and the unknowns. Now, specifically, it's a unique historical account that provides a little bit of a window into the Israelite legal system, as well as just how they went about making decisions. So we have a young man, we're not told how old he is. His mom is an Israelite woman. His father is an Egyptian. Now, remember, there were a number of Egyptians that when the Israelites went through the Exodus from Egypt, they thought, oh, we think the God of Israel is the right God. So they went with them. It could be that. But we also know that the Egyptian father is not mentioned here, although specifically, the mother is mentioned. And so some scholars believe well, maybe she had a child through an Egyptian father, back in Israel, but he's not actually present here anymore. In other words, the text is written in such a way to suggest he's not involved. He's either just not a believer who doesn't train his son, or he is not physically present or emotionally present or anything like that in the young man's life. So there's probably, first of all, a lesson in here about that, the presence of a godly father. But secondly, it is interesting that the text says in verse 12, they put the young man in custody until the will of the Lord should be made clear to them. So this is why they have to do that, because absolutely it was clear for a full-blooded Israelite, if you blasphemed the Lord, you were to be stoned to death. This kid isn't a full-blooded Israelite. So how much concession do we have for him that he maybe didn't get the full instruction that he should have? And what do we do in this situation? So Moses doesn't know what to do. He puts him in custody. He consults the Lord. The Lord says to him at that point, yes, I want you to treat him like you would an Israelite. And the people who heard him, the witnesses, put their hands on him, and he's supposed to be stoned to death. But I think the bigger point here is it's a little bit of a gray area. God has revealed his will about the Israelites. If they blaspheme, they get put to death. But he hasn't revealed his will at this point about what about somebody who has been assimilated into the Israelite community but hasn't had the full upbringing. It's a gray area. And what they have to do is they have to consult the Lord. Christians very often like black and white rules about what we are supposed to do in every circumstance. And I can't tell you how many different times I've heard Christians say yeah, I don't know what to do in my life. I just wish God would just tell me, give me an envelope and tell me what to do. What he wants us to do in these moments is exercise spiritual muscles of prayer, wrestling with principles. So there's different principles involved here that would apply to this circumstance. And then also consult fellow believers about what their input is, since the Spirit of God lives inside of them too. Those are the three things that you, generally speaking, want to always do in gray area types of decisions. What are the principles of God's word that I need to wrestle with? When I talk to God about this, what does he seem to be kind of stirring in my heart? And what do other people that I respect as being faithful believers, what are they doing? The Bible in general, is not exactly, it's more of a compass than a map. It gives us the general directions of where to go, not exactly how to figure out what to do in every particular situation. So believers need to consult God and fellow believers in unclear situations. Have you had either that you did well or did poorly, a major decision in life that you are just, I don't know what to do. I have no idea what to do, but I need to pray, I need to think through the principles, and I need to consult fellow Christians.
Well, when I went to anesthesia school, I went back and forth on this for like years. And when we moved to Milwaukee, there were no schools, no programs.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, well, this is God closing the door on this. I'll just be a nurse practitioner. And then I started a nurse practitioner program, and then there was an anesthesia program started in Milwaukee. And I did pray about it a lot and talked about it constantly and just went back and didn't know what to do. And then I was like, I'm just going to apply one time and kind of like let God handle it. And we've even talked about, we've known people who have applied to like multiple programs and haven't gotten in.
Yeah.
The
majority of people don't.
There's just so few programs. It's really difficult to get in. So like in my class, there were 10 of us and like 120 applicants. And we've talked about, like, there's nothing special about me. My grades were good, whatever. I had good experience. But there was nothing, there's nothing special about me over all of these other people who are applying. We've talked about that we felt like, yep, God really put me in this position to do this. So that was definitely one.
And I do remember praying about it. I do remember you and I, at least, I don't know if you talked to anybody else about it, but I know that we talked about it.
I talked to so many people about it.
But as far as like wrestling with principles of scripture, I think we talked about things like stewardship stuff along the way.
Because it was a big thing. Like if I'd already started a nurse practitioner program. B, that's not as intense of training, so you can work while you do that. Anesthesia school, you can't work. It costs a lot more. It's much more intensive.
Yeah.
So I think for the nurse practitioner, you had to do like 600 clinical hours, and for anesthesia, I did 3,000 clinical hours. Like that's clearly a big difference. But when I did get in, I felt like this was kind of a miracle, or God's hand in this too. The credits I had taken at UW Milwaukee for the nurse practitioner were more of like the core nursing doctorate classes, and those transferred into my new program. So it didn't shorten anything for me, but I took at least in the didactic, the classroom portions, I took one less class every semester than my cohorts. And so I did end up working very minimal, but I worked for like the first half of the program.
Yeah, which, I don't know if I ever really thought about this, but you were largely, so not only were you going to school during the week, but you're largely studying all weekend long, but just having one less class, doing things like even just getting together for worship and getting together with friends from church and being involved in some Bible study stuff along the way. Like, you were able to do that, whereas if you had one more class, it would have been more difficult. So I think, you can see kind of God's hand on those types of things too. But that's the whole seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, ask Him about decisions that we make, and, sacrifice everything else at the altar of the true God, and He'll work the rest of the details out. Kind of thing. All right, let's look at Leviticus 25 then, last chapter here. Again, I know it's the third one. If you haven't read it yet, go ahead and pause now to do that. But here's my summary for Leviticus 25. God told Moses at Mount Sinai to inform the Israelites that the land itself must also have a Sabbath year. It can be farmed for 6 years, but the seventh year should be one of rest, while the land must not be actively tended. Whatever it nonetheless produces just by itself, that is allowed to be eaten. After 7 of these Sabbath years, which amounts to 49 years, there's to be something called a Year of Jubilee. This takes place on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the Day of Atonement. And in that year, everyone is supposed to return to their own property, that which was promised to their family when they first entered into the promised land and had the land divided amongst the tribes and the families. This is to be a regular consideration in the entire Jewish economic system. They are never to take advantage of one another. They were to remember that the land all essentially belonged to the Lord, and that's why you could just give it back, because it was never yours in the first place. We're going to talk about the residual economic benefits of that. God promised to send amazing blessings in the 6th year, enough for 3 years worth that will hold them over through the 9th year. The Israelites were always to be mindful of their poor fellow Israelites and support them. They were not allowed to charge interest to one another. The Israelites could hire one another as workers, but weren't allowed to treat one another as slaves. And the Israelites, if enslaved by foreigners in the land, may always be redeemed by family members. At the very least, they will be released in the Year of Jubilee. Okay.
Can I say one more thing?
Sure.
Going back to anesthesia school, when I really think about it, I think I forget now, a year out of it, all the different blessings God provided, not just getting into school, but like during the program. So yes, I could work a little. I had one less class. I was able to be a TA, like a teacher's assistant for an undergraduate nursing class, and the lady I TA'd for was so kind and nice, a Christian lady. But not only did Marquette knock money off my tuition for that, they paid me to do that. They gave me like a stipend to do that.
Yeah.
I have 2 really good friends I still communicate with almost daily from the program. My friend's parents that I lived with for a semester in their basement, like that was, what a huge blessing that was, right? Some of my classmates were living in like different Airbnbs, and not only does it cost a fortune, but they are like completely on their own.
Yeah.
I had Christian people with me every day, like praying with me before meals every day, cooking me dinner every day. Like I really feel like he just blessed me like over and over and over through that program.
Yeah.
Almost as like a validation, like this is what you're supposed to do, or maybe not even that, but maybe just like, even though this is going to be tough, like I'll continue to like provide for you and show you a way through it.
Yeah. Yeah, and it continues to bless you through it. You still have those friends. You're being compensated very well for it. You're a bunch of different things. This goes back to that original point we had about looking back and doing celebratory, like almost anniversaries, because I think it's easy. It would be easy for you on a difficult day or difficult series of days to think, I got here, I earned this, I deserve this, and forget all the different doors that God opened for you to get to this place. I think it's very difficult to be generous to others in a variety of ways, financially and otherwise, when you think that you are a victim and when you think that you just deserve everything. When you realize that God has been opening doors for you along the way, that every good thing you have belongs to God and he's just showered it upon you, you start to get this sense of like, well, he gave it to me not to just hoard it, but like do things like give it away. And so I think people who are filled with gratitude and to such an extent that they think God has had a gracious hand upon their life are just more inclined to be good to others moving forward.
Yeah.
You know, so I think it's important to remember those things and probably set up something that we remind ourselves regularly.
I say whenever I'm having a bad day at work, I just think about where I was 1 year ago to that day.
Yeah.
And even, so what is it, June? Remember I had failed my pre-boards and I had to take them multiple times and I was so stressed out that they weren't going to let me finish the program around this time.
You know what?
Like what a miserable...
You know what I remember about that specifically? Is you being so upset that you thought we should stop doing Bible study because it's taking up too much time to whatever. And we had a critical conversation at that point about priorities and that sort of thing. So I'm glad we continue to push through.
Oh, so when you were saying like that allowing me to, one last class allowing me to attend worship, I was thinking in my head, like I know going into it, we said there are going to be certain things that I just continue to do. So, like, I'm going to obviously be in worship. Like, it's a non-negotiable for me.
Yeah.
And the other thing was I wanted to keep working out. And then I was thinking there was one more thing. What was it? But it was this.
The Bible study?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, we're going to continue to do this.
Yep.
Regardless of.
Yep. No, I'm glad we have. We're coming up on 300 episodes, but it's actually, so it's like 2.5 years now at this point.
It seems insane.
It's a chunk of our lives, yeah.
Sometimes I'm not always feeling it.
Yeah, which means that I'm the recipient of those not always feeling it.
I'm sure some of you who watch Alon can tell.
Adrienne has a very readable... She doesn't have a very good poker face, so yes, you can tell. But I appreciate you, like, the whole idea that we power through things because we know they're good, not just because we feel them.
Yes, it's a discipline thing. Like, you have to continue to put one foot in front of the other and to get through anything hard.
Yeah. All right, here's Year of Jubilee is our final devotional thought number 3 for the day. Israelites not only had a Sabbath day during the week, once a week, they not only had a Sabbath year once every 7 years, but they had a Sabbath of Sabbath years, which was every 49th year, which was called the Year of Jubilee. They weren't supposed to work the fields or have any kind of organized harvest, although they could eat the food that the ground naturally produced. But this is intentionally supposed to give rest. God cares about all of his creation, not just humans. He cares about humans, but he wants to give rest to the land. And he wants to give rest to the animals that, help harvest the field. And he wants to give rest to his humans as well. That year, interestingly, also contained like a Bible conference. And during that year, the people would gather together and the priests would reread to them from the book of Deuteronomy, the entire book of Deuteronomy, which is like the second giving of God's law. And they would do that during the Feast of Tabernacles, which is the one we said happens in what is essentially like our fall time. That said, one of the interesting details of Israel's history, we have no record of the Israelites ever actually celebrating the Sabbath years. And in fact, what scholars will suggest is there's a couple different passages that say when the Israelites went on, this is a really interesting detail, when the Israelites went into Babylon. So we're told that they are in captivity for 70 years. And what some of the prophets say is, yep, you're going to be going into captivity for 70 years to account for all the Sabbaths that you didn't celebrate. And so remember, this is over the course of about 500 years. They're going to go into captivity for 70 years. And they were essentially saying they missed 70 Sabbaths, which means for about 500 years, you multiply this all together, for about 500 years, they were failing to celebrate the Sabbaths in the Year of Jubilee because that to them just seemed like too much. Like we can't take a year off. We can't take that much time off and expect that we're going to be provided for. And God says, I'm going to collect those no matter what at some point because you've been unfaithful these past 500 years and not being fully... This is the whole you can't outrun God.
Oh my gosh, maybe if you don't ever take a Sabbath rest day from work, God's going to make you incapable of working.
It's possible. Well, so...
better get that long-term care insurance.
The thing is, we know that to be true. Like, that's just a fact of life. If you never take a rest, if you never sleep, if you constantly go, that's when you have heart attacks. And that, I don't mean to be insensitive to that, but we all know that level of stress and that level of inattentiveness to your physical welfare, that leads to health problems. That's God telling you you're a finite creature. The exact same things were happening on a national level with the Israelites. When they didn't honor the Sabbaths, he said, I'm going to collect on your unfaithfulness. And you're going to pay 70 years in captivity, and I'm going to get all those 70 years that you missed back. It's just a fascinating concept that, like, when God says something, like, it's just so foolish to try to defy him because he's going to win this argument. Just submit to the God who knows. I also want to say the Year of Jubilee thing. Different prophets, for instance, Isaiah kind of famously does this in 61, where he talks about a coming year of Jubilee, and he's specifically talking about the coming of the Messiah, who is going to, he says, come and set the captives free. Which, remember, anybody who was enslaved as like a servant at this point which happened because they owed a debt, so they were going to work it off. After these 49 years, really after 7 years, but then again after 49 years, they had to be released. And after 49 years, all of the land that had been sold from one family to the next had to be returned.
Isn't that so interesting? Because we have so many issues today. Like, part of the race issue is the fact that land has been completely bought up and passed down from white people to white people to white people, and there's nothing left.
It's impossible to transfer generational wealth, generally speaking, apart from ownership of property. And yes, this was absolutely part of the economic system that prevented wealthy landowners from hoarding the wealth and continuing to oppress. Because if you can't ever get any property, you're never able to build up generational wealth. And yes, so, I mean, a big issue, I mean, I know here in Milwaukee, but it's been elsewhere too, is the issue of redlining in cities where people of color couldn't get bank loans to buy properties. And therefore we're perpetually in a system of rent. And like, clearly this is why in America today, the average white family, for instance, has 18 times the familial income, familial net worth than the average African-American family. And it's just like, okay, clearly there's a system of problems here. And what God did is he built into their whole economic system. He said, this is the way it's going to be. After 49 years, you're going to give the property back. Now, admittedly, one of the things that they did, you'd say, well, that doesn't seem fair on the other end. With each passing year, as they got closer to the Year of Jubilee, the net property value would start to go down so that it wasn't as much of a loss. So like if somebody, okay, I paid the full amount for this property and now I got to give it back the next year. Well, you paid less than you would have 3 years earlier. But it's unquestionably fair in a sense, and it unquestionably helps to prevent from the wealthiest continuing to hold the poorest down. Anybody like modern Christians in America who have big issues with certain things that they just think sound so unfair and almost like socialist. Sometimes I want to remind people, like, the idea of like reparations. Look at the book of Exodus. God collects for the Israelites the money that they should have earned, that was taken away from them from the Egyptians over 400 years, and passes it on to the Israelites. I don't know how you describe that as anything but reparations. You know, and so like the idea when people start talking about that today, like I don't think I could in good conscience stand against some of that. You know, like it makes sense to me it makes sense from a like theological perspective. So I just think that the basic concept of the Year of Jubilee was very important, not only for the like economic welfare, not only for remembering God's goodness to us, but in terms of social like harmony. Like it curbed some of the sin nature in hoarding stuff. All right, that's Leviticus 25, and that's everything for today, I think. Thanks for bearing with us on 3 full chapters. I don't know that we'll ever do that again, but in Leviticus, we will.
I held off from singing the Year of Jubilee song that Forgiven sang.
I didn't know there was a Year of Jubilee song.
Yeah.
Well, maybe let's open the next episode with you singing the Year of Jubilee song. Heavenly Father, thank you for our time in your word today. Lord, we're struggling a little bit more to see relevance at times because Leviticus seems like such a different and foreign culture, and yet there's principles here that are absolutely valuable for us in terms of holiness, in terms of worship, in terms of the way we treat one another, in the terms of like the gray areas of life where we don't always know what to do. We can learn a ton from it. We thank you for your grace, and we thank you for pouring wisdom into us through the study of your timeless word. Help us to continue to grow up in it. In your name we pray. Amen. Thanks for studying with us today. We will see you next time as we close out Leviticus with the last 2 chapters, 26 and 27.